According to the final SEC report, the number was $64.8 billion. It's a figure so vast it loses all meaning. It's not money. It's a statistical event, an extinction-level impact on the financial landscape. Enough to fund NASA for 3 full years or to give $1,000 to every single person in France. And it had all simply vanished. But this colossal house of cards didn't begin to fall in a boardroom or on a chaotic trading floor. The unraveling started in a quiet Manhattan apartment with a confession. On December 10, 2008, a man sat his 2 adult sons down and uttered 7 words that would detonate their world. It's all just one big lie. The man was Bernie Madoff, not some shadowy outsider, but the very architecture of Wall Street's modern establishment. A former chairman of the NASDAQ, a pioneer of electronic trading. He wasn't just in the club, he was the club. He was seen as the safest pair of hands in the world. What the world didn't know was that Madoff's legitimate, trailblazing business operated on the 18th and 19th floors of New York's iconic Lipstick Building. But the real work, the engine of the entire myth, was hidden from plain sight, 1 floor below. On the 17th floor, a small, insular team was engaged in a fiction of unprecedented scale. For decades, they generated a flawless stream of fake profits, creating wealth out of thin air. At its core, the Madoff empire wasn't just built on a lie about money. It was built on a lie about access. But that raises 2 critical questions. How did a handful of people on a single floor orchestrate the largest fraud in history for decades without a single leak? And what did his own family, working just 1 floor above, truly know? The confession in 2008 was the explosion, but the fuse had been lit 8 years earlier in total obscurity. The first real warning didn't come from a panicked investor or a Wall Street rival. It came from a quiet Boston analyst, a quantitative specialist named Harry Markopolos. In May of 2000, he submitted a detailed, evidence-backed report to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Its title wasn't subtle. The world's largest hedge fund is a fraud. It was a direct accusation, a mathematical roadmap to the crime, and it was met with a profound institutional silence. This wasn't a one-time fluke. It was the beginning of a pattern. Over the next 8 years, Markopolos and his team would submit 4 more packages of evidence, each more detailed and more urgent than the last. They laid out the mathematical impossibilities of Madoff's operation with chilling clarity. They proved, for instance, that the trading volume Madoff claimed in certain options would have often exceeded the entire daily volume traded on the Chicago Board Options Exchange. It wasn't just unlikely, it was a violation of the laws of financial physics. Let that sink in. The firm's returns were impossibly smooth, never posting a significant loss. The trading strategy was demonstrably absurd. And the SEC, the nation's financial watchdog, had been handed a step-by-step guide to uncovering the crime on 5 separate occasions. Yet for nearly a decade after the first credible warning, they failed to act. The world's most sophisticated investors, the biggest banks, the sharpest minds in finance, they all looked the other way. Why? Because the returns were a steady 12% a year, and getting into Madoff's fund was a signal that you had arrived. After all, exclusivity was the real currency. This unraveling reveals something far more disturbing than a simple fraud. It points to a catastrophic failure of will, a complete breakdown in the architecture of oversight. At its core, the system wasn't just fooled, it was a willing participant in the delusion. This forces us to ask 2 devastating questions. How could an agency with subpoena power and an army of investigators fail to find a fraud that a single analyst had already solved for them? And more importantly, was this a case of simple, staggering incompetence, or was it something far more cynical? A system that chose not to look because it was too invested in the lie? So, incompetence or complicity? The easy answer is that the SEC was simply outmatched, a bureaucratic dinosaur trying to hunt a financial velociraptor. But the evidence suggests something far more unsettling. They weren't just missing the clues. They were actively ignoring a trail of breadcrumbs that led directly to the 17th floor. This wasn't a failure of intellect. It was a failure of will. The question isn't how they missed it, but why they chose not to see. In a prison deposition, Madoff himself expressed his own disbelief. "I was amazed," he said. "I was absolutely amazed that for 20 years this went on." He presents himself not as a master criminal, but as a bewildered beneficiary of a broken system, a man who couldn't believe his luck. And that forces us to confront the real, nuclear question of this entire saga. It stops being about one man's crime and becomes about the architecture of our trust. What if the regulators, the banks, the elite investors, all the gatekeepers of the financial world, weren't Madoff's victims? What if, consciously or not, they were his partners? The very people meant to protect the system held the door open for him, blinded by the one thing he offered that no one else could guarantee: certainty. The real fear isn't that a man like Madoff exists. It's that the system needs him to. This wasn't a failure of seeing. It was a failure of looking. The proof wasn't buried in encrypted hard drives. It was printed on every single account statement. The official story, the one Madoff sold to his elite clientele, was a masterpiece of misdirection called the split strike conversion strategy. It sounded impossibly sophisticated, a complex method of using options to generate steady returns in any market. But as analyst Harry Markopolos frantically tried to explain, the trading volume this strategy required was a mathematical fantasy. His 2005 report showed that for Madoff to execute his purported trades in S&P 100 options, he would have needed to trade more options than actually existed on the entire Chicago Board Options Exchange. The red flags didn't stop there. They multiplied. As documented in the SEC's own scathing postmortem, Report 509, Madoff's firm acted as its own broker-dealer, meaning he was essentially grading his own homework without any independent oversight. His trade confirmations weren't electronic, but mailed out on paper from an AS/400, a computer system obsolete even by 1990 standards. And the final, almost comical absurdity? The auditor for this $64.8 billion global enterprise wasn't a major accounting firm. It was a 3-person operation in a suburban strip mall run by a man named David Freeling. This was the architecture of the fraud: a nonsensical strategy, a closed-loop system, and a storefront accountant. It was all part of what we can call the Velvet Rope Deception, a mechanism where the technical complexity was just noise, designed to make you feel privileged for being included, not obligated to ask questions. The clues were so obvious, so screamingly loud, it becomes clear the lie wasn't designed to be perfect. It was designed to be ignored. What kind of person builds something like this? To understand the architect, you have to go back to the blueprint. Before the $64.8 billion phantom, before the 17th floor, before the fall, there was just Bernie Madoff, a kid from Queens with a few $1,000s saved from working as a lifeguard and installing sprinkler systems. He wasn't born into the old money of Wall Street. He was a scrappy outsider. In 1960, with the help of his accountant father-in-law, he founded Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities. He wasn't trying to build a house of cards. He was trying to storm the castle. His weapon was technology. While the New York Stock Exchange was a closed club of specialists trading on a physical floor, Madoff became a pioneer of the third market, using computers to trade stocks off exchange faster and cheaper. At its core, this was a legitimate, revolutionary business. He was a disruptor, building a better, more efficient machine. And for decades, the machine worked brilliantly. He became a titan of Wall Street, revered for his innovation. He helped launch the NASDAQ, the world's first electronic stock market, and would eventually serve as its chairman. He built a real, profitable, and deeply respected market-making firm. This was the empire on the 18th and 19th floors of the Lipstick Building, the one he brought his brother Peter into, the one where his sons, Mark and Andrew, would eventually build their entire careers. To the outside world, and even to his own family, Bernie Madoff wasn't just successful. He was the very architecture of modern, legitimate trading. He was unimpeachable. He had built the castle, and now he was its king. But the problem with being king is that you can never afford to lose. The catalyst, according to Madoff's own narrative, wasn't a single moment of greed, but a slow, creeping crisis during the market downturn of the early 1990s. For the first time, the steady, reliable Madoff machine began to falter. His exclusive circle of investors, friends, family, powerful institutions who had entrusted him with their fortunes, started getting nervous. The market was volatile, but they had been promised safety. They had been promised certainty. Now, they wanted their money back. And Madoff couldn't deliver. The losses were real, and they were catastrophic. He was facing a classic run on the bank, a moment that would have shattered his reputation, destroyed his family's name, and unraveled everything he had spent 30 years building. He was at a precipice. He could admit the truth, that he, like everyone else, was vulnerable to the whims of the market. Or he could find another way. He could lie. So he lied. It started small, a temporary fix. He used new investor money to pay off the old, just to stop the bleeding. It was a desperate act to buy time. But the lie worked. panic subsided. And in that moment of relief, a terrible new logic was born. He had discovered a way to create the one thing the market could never offer: perfect, unshakable consistency. In a prison interview years later, he would rationalize the choice. "I thought of myself as a good person," he claimed. "I got myself in a terrible situation, and I was not able to extricate myself from it." He didn't dismantle his legitimate business. He quarantined the fraud. He built a shadow operation one floor below, a secret engine designed not to make money, but to generate paper. He had survived the fall. Now he had to engineer a new, hidden machine to make sure it could never happen again. A machine that would run in the dark for the next 2 decades. So how did he do it? How did one man with a small team on a single floor sustain a lie of this magnitude for decades? The answer is a brutal anticlimax, and that's precisely what makes it so chilling. You have to understand, Madoff wasn't running one machine. He was running 2, stacked on top of each other. The 18th and 19th floors housed his legitimate, pioneering market-making firm, the engine of his reputation. But the 17th floor housed something else entirely. It wasn't an investment firm. It was a printing press. First, let's finally put to rest the ghost of the split-strike conversion strategy. It was never a strategy. It was a story. A brilliant piece of intellectual theater designed to do one thing: intimidate. Its complexity was a feature, not a bug. It created a permission structure for the world's most sophisticated investors to abandon their own due diligence. To ask how it worked was to admit you weren't smart enough to be in the room, and nobody wanted to be outside that room. The strategy was a phantom, a complex-sounding spell that made critical thinking feel like a social faux pas. The second half was the machine itself. And when you finally see behind the curtain, you don't find a supercomputer running a revolutionary algorithm. You find something far more banal. According to Frank DiPascali, Madoff's finance chief, the fraud was run by a handful of back-office employees with little to no formal financial training. Their primary tool wasn't a Bloomberg terminal, it was an IBM AS/400 mainframe computer, a piece of technology that was already a relic by the year 2000. Their job wasn't to trade. Their job was to lie on paper. The process was devastatingly simple. Each month, DiPascali and his team would look at the S&P 100's performance. Then, they would simply invent trades. They'd pick stocks that had performed well and retroactively buy them for client accounts, assigning a plausible date and price. They would then generate millions of pages of fake trade confirmations and account statements, which were then mailed out. The entire $65 billion illusion wasn't the product of some financial superweapon. It was the result of glorified data entry, a Potemkin village built of paper and ink. This is the architecture of the Velvet Rope Deception, an imaginary, complex strategy on the outside to keep you from questioning the primitive, simple fraud on the inside. Let's be clear about the scale. We're not just talking about wealthy individuals. We're talking about the life savings of thousands. University endowments, major charities like Elie Wiesel's Foundation for Humanity, which lost everything, pension funds for teachers and firefighters. The final tally from trustee Irving Picard estimates the actual cash loss by investors was nearly $20 billion. That's not paper wealth. That is real money vanished from the real world. Enough to pay for 4 years of college for over 180,000 students. The system was engineered to exploit a fundamental human need, the desire to belong. The returns weren't the primary product. The access was. The feeling of being chosen, of being part of an inner circle that had access to a secret wellspring of stability in a chaotic world. In the end, it was never about the split-strike conversion. It was never about the returns. Exclusivity was the real currency. So the mechanism is exposed. A simple fraud wrapped in a complex lie delivered through a system of social engineering. A house of cards built on an obsolete computer and the desperate human need for certainty. But this only deepens the most troubling question of all. With a fraud this simple, this reliant on paper and archaic technology, how could the most powerful financial regulator on Earth, armed with years of credible warnings, find absolutely nothing? The question left hanging in the air isn't just how the SEC missed the fraud. At its core, the real question is whether they ever truly looked. The agency's own internal investigation, the damning 500-page OIG 509 report, paints a picture not of a brilliant criminal outsmarting the authorities, but of an authority that seemed determined to be outsmarted. Investigators were intimidated by Madoff's reputation. They accepted forged documents. They failed to take the most basic step: independently verifying Madoff's trades with a third party. A single phone call could have detonated the entire scheme. That call was never made. So you're left with two possibilities, and neither is comforting. The first is that the world's most powerful financial regulator was paralyzed by a level of incompetence so profound it borders on dereliction of duty. The second is more cynical, that the system didn't fail, but rather functioned exactly as designed. Perhaps it chose not to look too closely at one of its own, because pulling on that one loose thread threatened to unravel the entire tapestry of Wall Street's self-mythology. This unraveling then leads us to the final, most painful open loop, the family, the firewall. His sons, Mark and Andrew, who worked their entire adult lives on legitimate floors, just one staircase away from the fraud. The official story is that they were the heroes, the ones who turned their own father in the moment he confessed. And yet, for decades, they lived lives of unimaginable luxury, funded by a machine whose mechanics they never questioned. They saw the impossibly consistent returns. They knew their father's investment business was shrouded in secrecy. They were either the fraud's most intimate victims or its most oblivious beneficiaries. The fallout of that ambiguity was absolute. On December 11, 2010, exactly 2 years to the day after his father's arrest, Mark Madoff died by suicide. He was 46. He left behind a 2-year-old son. There is no clearer evidence of the human cost of this house of cards. The lie didn't just consume money, it consumed lives. In the end, Bernie Madoff was sentenced to 150 years in federal prison, where he died in 2021. The accountant from the strip mall got 10 years. A handful of others from the 17th floor also served time. In a stunning turn, the trustee Irving Picard has managed to recover over $14.5 billion for the victims. A historically unprecedented success. But you can't recover lost decades. You can't recover a life. The Madoff plague teaches us a brutal lesson. It wasn't just a failure of regulation. It was a failure of psychology on a global scale. He didn't just sell a fake strategy. He sold a feeling of belonging to a tribe that had transcended risk. He understood that for the world's elite, the one thing more valuable than money was the story they could tell about how they made it. Madoff is gone, but the architecture of belief that enabled him, the desire for exclusive access, the deference to authority, and the willful blindness of those paid to protect us, remains. The real question isn't how one man built a house of cards, but why the entire system was so eager to live inside it. And who is building the next one? Madoff's fraud was built on trust and complexity, devastating thousands. But what if the same predatory playbook is being run legally by an entire industry we depend on for our lives? Our next video exposes how the American hospital system was engineered for profit, not patience. Subscribe and follow now.